You're listening to Always Player One, a solo board gaming podcast.
Hello and welcome to Always Player One. I'm Scruffy.
And I'm Norm, and today we're talking about Mage Knight. Again. Yes, we've covered Mage Knight before in episode 3, but we've got a lot more to unpack today. Today we're specifically looking at the randomness in Mage Knight, and here to help us with this, back again, it's Kendall McKenzie. Kendall, welcome to the show.
Hello, it's nice to be here, as per usual. Yeah, always like coming on the show.
If this is an unfamiliar voice to you, if you're a first-time Always Player One listener and you're thinking, who's Kendall McKenzie? Well, they've been on the show 4 times. So briefly, Kendall, who are you?
Hello, I make various things, and I made a print-and-play game that was the first print-and-play game that you featured on the show. It's episode 5. It's called Rollway Station. That's free. There's a sequel coming out soon, so look forward to that. It's a roll and write train game. I hosted the Christmas quiz. That was a lot of fun. Just sort of generally hang around. I moderate the Discord as well. Not that we really need to do much moderation on there, but yeah, you've probably spoken to me if you're on the Discord.
Yeah, Kendall is amazing and insightful, and we'll be bringing a lot of intellect and smartness to our episode today, as always. Isn't that right, Kendall?
Well, I mean, as much as I can muster.
Perfect. If you haven't checked out the episodes of Kendall in, then I'm sure after this episode you'll be eagerly looking them up. So, without any further ado then, let's move on to talk about Mage Knight a little bit, shall we, guys?
Yeah,
Sounds
sure.
agreeable, Scruffy.
Awesome. So just for anyone who doesn't know what Mage Knight is, we do have a really in-depth description of how the game plays in our episode 3. So feel free to go and check that out. We'll just give a kind of real quick synopsis of what Mage Knight is and how it plays right now, though. So in Mage Knight, you play a titular Mage Knight. You pick a scenario to play, and there are various different scenarios that will see you traveling across the map, taking on fortified creatures and unfortified creatures, slaying dragons to gain fame and achieve the scenario's specific goal. The game centers around a deck of cards. It's a deck builder game, and that represents your character's abilities. They also have a few skills and collect other different powerful tools to assist them in slaying the enemies and achieving their goals.
Yeah, essentially Mage Knight is, as you say, Scruffy, a deck builder game. As you level up, gain fame, and move across the map and explore the board, you will be adding more cards to your deck. You also be adding power to your tableau through various other cards and skills as you level up. But at its heart, Mage Knight is an adventure game. Mage Knight is a game of exploration and challenge. And Mage Knight is also a game with a very high skill ceiling. This is a game where you can really improve on. But interestingly, Mage Knight has a very healthy dose of randomness, which is why we're looking to talk about that today, because normally you think a game with a high skill cap, a game with a lot of planning involved, that's probably a game low in randomness. But Mage Knight flies in the face of that. It's full of randomness, and yet its skill cap is exceedingly high. So we want to look at the sophisticated use of randomness in this game and really break down what sort of agency the players have over those decisions today.
Absolutely. The main sort of decision space for you on your turn is in hand management, and we'll unpack that a bit as we go. But Norm is absolutely right there when he says that randomness plays a huge role in what you encounter and the options that open up to you during the game.
Excellent. So where do you want to begin, Scruffy? Because there's a lot to unpack with this one.
Yeah, well, I'm just going to throw this out there straight away right at the start of the episode. This is the first time in a while for the Always Player One I've done a playthrough, and that will be up on my YouTube, hopefully in tandem with this episode. So you guys can check that out. So I would love to start by kind of talking about any recent games you guys have had and how much fun you've been having with Mage Knight, or even just games from the past, and what it is that draws you to Mage Knight and back to Mage Knight to play again. And also, I think it would be nice to talk about the different ways we like to play the game as well.
I'd love Kendall to start with this one, because we've spoken about Mage Knight before, and we've kind of said about why we love it in episode 3. So, Kendall, why don't you take this one, if that's okay?
Yeah, of course. I mean, for me, it scratches a very sort of planning-y, kind of buildy-uppy kind of itch. It's got this really satisfying arc to it as you kind of gain in power and you're iterating on your deck by adding cards and maybe occasionally removing one or whatever. And as you move across the map, you do get this kind of build-up. And honestly, part of it's the aesthetics as well. Part of this, the aesthetics. You get the hex map building up as you go, which I find really, really satisfying. I actually often find myself yearning to play Age of Wonders, which is a totally different, really kind of game, but it has the same sort of grand strategy feel and a similar aesthetic with the map. All hexagons in Age of Wonders, all hexagons in Mage Knight hexagons are just the best.
It's very pleasing, isn't it?
It is very pleasing. It's got a lot of knobs and dials to twiddle. And I mentioned in episode 20 for Clans of Caledonia when I guest hosted there that one of my favourite things about that game is there's a lot of different knobs to twirl and buttons to press and everything. And just every time that you press a button, you just get a really nice, satisfying bit of fun out of it. And I get the same vibe from Mage Knight, even more so.
Yeah, I mean, just taking a bit of a sidetrack from randomness for a moment, it does the kind of extrinsic reward thing we hinted on in the Clans of Caledonia episode really well, doesn't it? Where after every single battle, after every encounter, every decision you make, when you succeed at it, you get something. You take that mage tower, you get a spell. And then sometimes, you get an extra little thing as well because you level up. And so you're always getting the fame, which is pushing you towards leveling up, but sometimes you actually cross a threshold as well and level up and get an extra, additional, extraneous reward for your hard work.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it is hard work sometimes doing the handling the cards.
I've heard Mage Knight described as it feels like I need to do my taxes just to move across the board. But really, like when you do your taxes to move across the board and defeat a keep, it really feels like you then get a letter from HMRC saying they owe you money, which, you know, that's a great it's a great feeling. And I'll happily do my taxes for a payday every time.
That's such a good analogy.
And I think, Scruffy, to your point about getting sort of double rewards all the time, the times in which you're most unlikely to get double rewards are when you fight more ordering orcs, because they give you the least amount of fame compared to all other enemies that you would face, and they're not on sites that give rewards for conquering them, so they are very unlikely to give you double rewards. So in the design, when you kill them, you get reputation as well as fame as well. So even those like cannon fodders to your Mage Knight, you're still rewarded twice for making the effort to go and kill them. So yeah, absolutely, you hit the nail on the head. You are, you know, it's a game full of reward and making you feel like, smart, like a smart cookie.
It's very satisfying whenever you achieve any sort of goal in that game that you set yourself on the turn, or even if you can't quite do what you want, just having those orcs to deal with are a nice sort of secondary route sometimes on your turn. If you couldn't quite maybe take that keep on, maybe you can take a maraudering orc a couple of tiles away instead. Yeah, I think that is a real draw for the game for sure. What about you, Norm?
Yeah, and for myself, Mage Knight is my personal favourite solo board game of all time. It's my second favourite board game of all time, you know, solo or multiplayer. And it's a game that I've played close to 100 times, I think somewhere in the 70s mark-ish. If you think that's close to 100, you know, round it up.
Closer to 100 than 0.
Indeed.
1 is closer to 100 than 0. You can't unplay a game. So if you've played it one time, you're closer to having played it 100 times.
That's true.
There you go. Well, then in that case, I've played it close to 1,000 times. And, but genuinely, I played the game, you know, 70-ish times, somewhere in that region. I don't track my plays, but I did last year, and I played it I think it was just over 30, and that was quite a slow year for me with Mage Knight. So I think even my most reserved estimates would be somewhere in the 70s, but it may even be higher and close to 100. So I obviously love the game. If you want to know exactly what my thoughts are, I really laid it all bare in episode 3, all the reasons why I love it. But yeah, what I'm really interested to talk about specifically today is the use of randomness in the game, and I'm absolutely itching. I'm chomping at the bit to get that unpacked. So, if it's okay with you, Scruffy, I'd really like to start unpacking that, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm keen to hear your thoughts.
Okay, before we dive into the randomness, I think we have to give a little bit of context as to what different types of randomness are and what we're kind of looking at today.
Yeah.
And I don't really know where to begin with that one, but Kendall, you were doing a little bit of research into this, and I was wondering what you could share in regards to input and output randomness.
So, input randomness and output randomness is a term that you might be familiar with. Essentially, the difference is in input randomness is when you are given a random event and then you make your decision after the random event. So something like you roll some dice and then you pick which one you want to use, or you draw a hand of cards and you pick which one you're going to play. That's input randomness. The idea being that there is randomness, you're not sure what you're going to get, but you don't have to make a decision until after you've seen it. And then there's output randomness, where you make your decision and then you have a random event that kind of determines the effectiveness of that decision. So the classic example would be in something like Dungeons and Dragons would be rolling to hit. You know, you say, I want to attack the orc with my axe. Do I hit? Roll the die. You've made the decision. Then you see if it works. That's output randomness.
Or for board gamers, maybe something like Risk.
Yeah, something like Risk, something like any sort of combat game. A lot of combat games have it. They'll have rolling to hit, rolling for damage. Or it could be something like saying, I want to visit this area on the board, which is going to let me draw an event card. And whatever happens on the event, that's output randomness, because you draw it, you don't know what you're going to draw when you make the decision to get the event.
Even in quote unquote modern Euro games, if you still consider Settlers of Catan a modern game, you know, Settlers of Catan has output randomness in that you choose where to place your settlements, and then every turn you roll to see what resources are successfully produced. You don't know when you build your settlement there if it's going to produce. You might know the likelihood, but it's still output randomness, which determines if that is a successful place to build.
Yeah, and I decided to do a bit of digging into sort of the history of input and output randomness as a term. And from what I can tell, I didn't do a huge amount, so please forgive me if this is wrong, but it seems to be coined by a designer called Keith Burgun, who has made a few sort of mobile games. He's made some tabletop games and stuff. And he has some very strong opinions on randomness. So when I read through some of his articles where he initially coins the terms, I kind of started to think, is this actually as useful and unbiased as it first appears? Because immediately it appears to be just a simple categorization, right?
And I think by and large that's how it's used in the hobby at the moment, right? The sort of innocent categorization. But I have a feeling you're about to blow our minds right now with your findings.
I don't know if I'm going to blow any minds, but I want to kind of contextualize the terms, because Burgun really dislikes output randomness. He really, really hates it. If you go ahead and read the articles where he sort of coins the terms and talks more about randomness, and I'm sure Scruffy will put links in the description. Mm-hmm. He really dislikes the output randomness, and he kind of thinks it shouldn't ever really be used in strategy games. And his reasoning kind of makes sense, right? It divorces the game state from the decisions leading up to it. So there's this fantastic example that I love from Little Wars, which is the very first war game. It was written by H.G. Wells. And he says in the rulebook, rash is the man who trusts his life to the spin of a coin. one impossible paladin slew in succession 9 men and turned defeat to victory, to the extreme exasperation of the strategist who had led those victims to their doom. And what Keith Burgun would argue is the lucky player who ended up winning that game, described in the book, didn't make any decisions to win. The actual outcome of the game is divorced from the decisions that the players made moving up to that. And I was interested to hear what you guys think about that, because I feel like you're probably not quite so harsh on output randomness.
That's so interesting, and what a wonderful quote to bring in as well. I think I came into solo gaming very much in a similar camp, and I think in multiplayer games, output randomness can be the death of the competition, in that if you have too much of it in a game, or even just any of it that's noticeable or has an impact, then you are shifting the reward emphasis away from the players, their skill, their choices, and playing the game optimally, and putting it into the realm of chance. And it's just like you say in that wonderful quote there, it doesn't make for necessarily a very fair strategic game. It might work fine in games where strategy isn't the kind of focus of the game, or where you're not testing the players on those skills. A party game, for example, fine, doesn't matter so much. But in terms of a highly competitive strategy game, output randomness is often the death of the game, I think. In a solo game, however, well, now I've started to realize that since you are only ever really playing against the game, output randomness can, in effect, become almost a substitute for another player and the unpredictability of another player. And I'd love to get your guys' takes on that as a concept. But I'll give you kind of an example of when it kind of recently I noticed it. I mean, this has been in the back of my mind for a while now. But in the Mage Knight playthrough I was doing for this episode, I had just reached a point where I was exploring and just got to the point where I was ready to see the cities. And I'm sure all of you Mage Knight players and veterans out there will have had this moment where I explored, got ready, was geared up to go, and drew a tile that had just a bunch of impassable or difficult to move through terrain right there, right in front of me. And that is purely output randomness. The flip of the tile, the exploration tile, isn't something I can account for. I make my decision, then I flip the tile, output randomness. But the story that creates and the kind of the pushback from the world there enriched the game for me and made it more fun. Didn't make it as fair as playing Mage Knight, where you could see the tiles and what was coming, but it made the game more fun and interesting. And I think that is only something that I feel comfortable with in a solo game. In a multiplayer game of Mage Knight, and I'm sorry I'm rambling here, guys, but in a multiplayer game of Mage Knight, I would feel a lot more annoyed if I got an impassable city and my opponent who I'm playing against got a really easy route into their city just from the luck of the exploration. But in a solo game, it's a story. And in a sense, it's a kind of conflict between you and the game.
Well, yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, Scruffy. And I think, output randomness accounting for the sort of reaction of what a player can do, or something just opposing to you to give you complications is absolutely fine in a solo game. Your example specifically of exploration is something that I want to come on to in a moment, obviously when we break down the individual moments of randomness later on, because even in exploration there is some form of mitigation and an agency there for you as a player. If I can have a moment to sort of react to what Kendall said just then, that sort of quote that you used there, Kendall.
Yeah.
My take on that would be, well, one, it's obviously a very extreme view. It's kind of a view that doesn't take in any of the nuances with output randomness. It's saying that output randomness is a decision and then a random event. But here's the thing, it's not that case in every game. It's decision, random event, and then guess what? You've got another turn. So there is another decision following that. And that's where it becomes very interesting, I think. You know, in Mage Knight, when you delve a dungeon and you get an enemy that was slightly harder than you may have wanted, that's bad output randomness. But now you have a chance to plan your attack. You have a chance to respond to that randomness. And I think I think that's where these sort of terms get very interesting, because if you categorize it in random event and then decision, that's input. Decision and then random event, that's output. But what you find kind of interesting is they start bleeding into other turns. You start making decisions based on your previous output randomness on the previous turn. So what is that? It blurs the lines a little more. And I think another thing I want to say is, I think a lot of what Keith Burgun's saying there is because it sounds like they attribute a lot of value to the word strategy. And I think that's something that we as a hobby do to a kind of almost fetish level. And sorry for bringing the tone down, but the idea that a game needs to be strategic in order to be fun or interesting or even a game of skill is absolutely absurd. It's absolutely absurd. And I would go as far as to say that I don't think Mage Knight has any strategy involved in the game. And still has a high skill ceiling.
There's so many.
There you go.
There's so many paths to explore here. So many. We're going to have to put a pin in about 15 different things.
There's a lot I want to take issue with there. Yeah, I'll let you go ahead and say your bit now, but there's a lot I want to circle back to there, Norm, because I think we're going to get our fighting gloves on here.
I'm happy to. I'm sure the truth is somewhere in the middle, but also not, because I'm right. But carry on.
Well, I want to pick up on what you said actually about the fuzz. Is I initially, when I first heard about input and output randomness, I kind of thought, yeah, that scans that seems to be a catch-all. But actually, in kind of diving into this a bit more, I think there's a lot more fuzz. I don't think it's as clear-cut as it's often made out to be. And you touched on that just there, Norm. But I was thinking of more singular examples, right? Because you can argue that any kind of output randomness is just input randomness for the next turn. But I wasn't hugely satisfied with that as an argument until I thought about getting an artifact in Mage Knight. Now, when you get an artifact in Mage Knight, you draw multiple cards and you pick which one you want. But you can't see the cards when you initially make the decision to attack the site that's going to give you an artifact. So is that input randomness or output randomness? Because you make a decision, you're going to attack the enemy that's going to give you an artifact. You then get the random event, and then you make another decision. So the gaining of the artifact sandwiches the random event. It's neither input nor output.
It's a bit of both, isn't it? I mean, you know that artifacts are the most powerful cards in the game, though. So whatever artifact you get is superior to any of the advanced actions or spells you could get. So in that sense,
potentially.
Well, I mean, entirely. They are more. The balance of the cards is more powerful.
Well, that may be the case, Scruffy, but the thing is, the artifacts are situational. They're only good in the situation. How many times have you had the most powerful card in your deck that you've actually had to use sideways because in your current situation it's not working? So it's perfectly, you can say it's a safe decision, but I've had it happen many times where I've drawn two artifacts and gone, I'd like to draw again, please.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. But that's true of all the cards. And so they're situational in the same way that all the cards are. They're just more powerful iterations of the other cards. So what Kendall's asking is it input or output randomness? I would argue that it's definitely got a bit of output randomness there, in that you're not sure what you're going to get specifically, but it is entirely input randomness in that you are getting a good card, a very good card.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of...
I would disagree.
I think that's part of the design of a lot of the artifact cards. It does kind of mitigate that risk of not getting something good because they are so powerful. It mitigates that risk. But I'm not looking at it as a specific example in the sense of does it work in the game. I'm trying to look at it as an example of interrogating the input-output model, I suppose. And I think it's an example that doesn't exactly fit in that input-output model perfectly. And it makes me wonder, is the input-output model, the perfect model?
Yeah, is it a binary?
Yeah, but the thing is, when you said it to me, Kendall, my immediate thought was exactly different to Scruffy's, was that it's output. You make a decision to get an artifact, and then you have a random event, you then make another decision, but it's not a gameplay decision. It's just I pick a card. It is an in-game decision, but it's not through gameplay. Whereas you earn the artifact, you earn the random event through making a move in the game. And I think that's, for me, you made the decision. I don't know. Maybe this is another layer of definition we need to put on top of input output.
Yeah, I think that's what Kendall's getting at, isn't it? That it needs to be a caveat, doesn't there, for those choices that you make that lead to some sort of mysterious potential outcome. That's kind of, it's the same with the skills in Mage Knight. When you level up, you're not sure if you're going to get a skill.
Getting a skill would be kind of exactly the same. It would be a hybrid. It would be of input output in exactly the same way. I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with input output as a system, but I think it's just good to kind of keep in mind it seems to have been coined by a person who has a very specific idea of what's good and what's not. And I think a lot of people who are going to use these terms don't necessarily agree with Burgun's opinions on what they are, and maybe there's room for something else. And I want to hold my hands up here and say I'm not trying to trash Keith Burgun at all. I disagree with him on a lot of game design stuff, but I actually find reading his stuff to be really, really interesting because it really makes you interrogate why you think what you think. He's very good at arguing his points and countering arguments. So it forces you to come up with more interesting and more robust kind of arguments for why you disagree.
Nice.
So I would recommend checking out the articles.
Links in the description.
Yeah, I think regarding the input-output fuzziness, you mentioned there that there could be an argument made for all output randomness is input randomness from the previous turn, and that is a weak argument, and I agree with you, Kendall, it is a weak argument. But one of my favourite counter-arguments to that was by Gilhover from the Ludology podcast and from, designer of the Networks and High Rise and all the other wonderful games, Wordsy.
One of my favorite word games.
And one of my favorite counter arguments to that was from Gilhover. He used an analogy of drumming. They said, if a drummer is drumming snare, hi-hat, and another drummer was drumming hi-hat, snare, off, one on beat and one off beat. If you zoom out, they're playing the same music. If you zoom out, they're doing the same thing, but it will sound different. And yeah, that's just one of my favorite analogies because yes, if you zoom out, it goes randomness, decision, or decision, randomness. If you look back far enough from a high enough vantage point, that will look very similar. But when you're there listening to it or playing it, you will understand the difference in feeling.
I'm really glad you bring up that analogy because that's exactly the sort of issue I had with the thing you were saying about, well, one of the issues, but with the thing you were saying about specifically output randomness maybe being input randomness for the next turn is the macro. Then it's the player didn't have the initial. They weren't the unmovable mover in the situation. And what I mean by that is the first instigator of the action. Something random was the unmovable mover, and then the player had to react to that. So it puts people at an unequal footing. It would be like in a game of Monopoly starting with a random amount of money each. It affects your decisions. Now you can't buy this one, so you have to only buy this one. And you could say, well, now you have a new decision space to work in, but it's not a fair one. So I guess that's where the kind of negative energy towards output randomness comes in, especially within strategy games, is it's about fairness, isn't it?
Well, you could say the same about input. You could say, because in that example, Scruffy, that's actually input randomness. So, it's although output will often feel less fair, it goes both ways. It entirely depends on how the designer has implemented the randomness. And I think that's the thing. You can't say one's good and one's not good. It's more nuanced than that. It's more how it's implemented and where it sits with you as a player, I feel.
That's a really good point, Noel.
Thanks.
Output randomness does often feel less fair. I think is it feels less fair, even if it's not, because in input randomness, it's like, well, you had no control. You just have to do the best with what you've been given. Whereas output randomness, it can often feel like you decide to do something and then the game tells you, no, you can't do that. So I get what you were saying about the fairness. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I think I fall into the trap of, like a lot of people, and like Keith Burgun, of seeing output randomness as inherently more unfair, because when you're playing the game and in the moment, it feels unfair. For example, if you were in Monopoly and you had to roll to see if you were able to buy a property, that would feel quite unpleasant. But there are really lovely forms of output randomness, as we've already hinted to, some kind of nice moments where it doesn't feel as unfair. It actually reminds me of a game design theory I was hearing about recently, where output randomness often only really works well and is fun when the result of the randomness is a benefit rather than a punishment. So in game design, if you make a random event give you a power up, and then that power up be a good power up or just an all right power up, it doesn't feel like as bad.
Yeah, I mean that's like loss aversion 101, isn't it? It feels proportionally worse to lose something than it does to gain something. So yeah, absolutely. That bleeds into every form of game design. And just like with input and output randomness, loss aversion is just another tool in designers' back pockets for them to manipulate your feelings throughout the game and try to I don't know, coax you into taking certain actions, which I think is interesting. I don't know what you think about that one, Kendall.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, I generally agree. And there was just one more thing I kind of wanted to bring up about the input output kind of discussion that came up in my research, and it was a really lovely quote that someone wrote in the comments to one of Burgun's articles. But before I can kind of go into why I like that, I need to talk about the 3 pockets of Tovak's trousers.
Okay.
So this is my theory of the 3 things you need to put in your pocket in Mage Knight, what the game is kind of actually about at its core. And at its core, I boiled it down, and you may disagree on this. I think ultimately, all Mage Knight is about when you're playing the full conquest or solo conquest scenario is 3 things. It's about building up to, being able to kill enemies, being able to avoid wounds, and move relatively fast so that you can do that final city assault. And that kind of seems really reductive, right? There is more to the game than that. But ultimately, the first 5 turns of the game, often 5 rounds, are just building up to that final city assault. And the first 5 rounds, you are planning and adding to your deck so that when you make that final assault, you will be able to kill the enemies, avoid the wounds, and move to get there before the game's over. Are you kind of on board with that? I mean, do you agree with that? Or
I mean, Kendall, I'm glad you said it, because it's actually one of the things I was going to bring up to sort of back up my clickbaity kind of opinion that I said at the beginning, that Mage Knight is a 0 strategy game. Is that well, again, I think I genuinely think the only reason you guys would disagree is because of the amount of value attributed to the word strategy. But yeah, the one of the things that I was going to bring up, Kendall, was exactly that. Like, what is a good strategy for Mage Knight? Well, it is be strong enough to kill things and take on the cities. It is to avoid wounds, and it is also to make it to the cities in time to do it. And that is no more of a strategy than what somebody who's just read the rulebook and never played the game would be able to tell you. Like, if you just read the rulebook, you go, wounds are bad. I need to do this in this many rounds, and I level up by killing things. Like, you don't even need to play the game to know that. That's not high-level strategy. You can't plan the points in between that 3 pockets that you were describing there, Kendall. You can't really go, and the way you kill things is only attack keeps. Like, that doesn't work. And it's because of the way the randomness works, which I want to unpack in a minute. But before I do, I want to allow you a chance to reply to that.
Yeah, well, if we put the strategy to one side for a moment, because that's I like that you agree with me on the 3 pockets. The point I was making about the output randomness being related to that is there was a fantastic quote in the comments on a Keith Burgun article where a person called Ben Sly said, for instance, not knowing beforehand if a game-winning attack will hit will cause a skilled player to have a much deeper gameplay experience at the end of an otherwise solved game, as they'll have to prepare a contingency plan in case it misses. Now, the equivalent for that in Mage Knight would be not knowing if the amount of attack cards you have is enough to kill everything in the city, because you don't know exactly what's in the city. And it's about not knowing if the amount of block cards and skills you have will be enough. And I thought about that, and I thought, yeah, that's actually a really, really fantastic point. Because if you could see the city, if it was purely input randomness, you draw the city randomly at the start of the game, but you know what it's going to be right from the beginning. You know you've got the monsters in that particular composition. You don't really need to play the last turn, because you can just go, yeah, well, I've got enough attack to kill all of them. I've got enough block to defend all of them. I've got enough move to get there in time. Yeah, I could probably win. And then you rob yourself of that exciting conclusion. And I thought that was a really good point. And I just wanted to bring that up at the end of the discussion of the output randomness before we moved on to the strategy.
Yeah, I really like that. That's really interesting. Like, I think that really strikes to the heart of how output randomness can, and I suppose it's making me even question whether it can have a place in multiplayer games as well, and even in deeply strategic games, where as long as it's handled right and so long as it's fair, I think that's where you can kind of play around and have fun. I mean, even something like, it made me realize that something like in Mage Knight, drawing your hand at the end and getting the composition of cards that you hoped that you'd get to take on the city, or that you'd been working towards getting, is entirely output randomness. And it's kind of so baked into that. And it's some things that we just take kind of for granted in so many games that we still see as deeply strategic games, that there are so many different ways to kind of feed us this output randomness in a way that still feels, and perhaps even is, fair, that yeah, it can have a strong place in a game, and a place to make a game fun and exciting and a real story experience, I think.
And I think it also comes down to, and you, Scruffy, you've used the word strategic like so many times that we're definitely moving on to this after I finish this point. But before we do, yeah, like if I could allow a final word on that, Kendall, because I think that's lovely, and I think it hits the heart of, gaming isn't just about how clever you are at planning. It's also about exciting moments and being able to tell stories from your table. And the output randomness moments in something like Twilight Imperium, for example, those moments are the moments people tell stories about for months and months after playing.
The stand-up die roll moment, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. It's everyone's off their table, even if you're not involved in that moment. Everybody stands up as your one last defender on the planet, just somehow holds out and ends up winning, or doesn't, and gets crushed in a really valiant effort. And you think, wow, what a story that told.
Your paladin takes on the 9 men.
Yes,
exactly.
Yes, and you could say it's the death of strategy or whatever melodramatic language you want to use, but the truth is, it's exciting, and that's just a fact. It's exciting. It tells a story, and it's good.
Really, really agree with you. And in a solo game especially, I think potentially if I were playing Mage Knight multiplayer, that wouldn't matter so much to me when I do play multiplayer. But yeah, solo, 100%. The nice arc, the nice story really makes the game satisfying.
But we're all seeing here, apart from, with the exception of myself, who's being antagonistic, and I apologize for that. But we've been talking about, even in a strategic game, it could be interesting, as if that is some lofty goal to reach, being a strategy game. So I think we should kind of unpack our own definitions of strategy and maybe see where you sit with that. I've made my opinion quite clear that I don't think Mage Knight is a strategy game, and I'll come on to why in a moment. But one of the reasons why it's important to unpack is because one of the criticisms that is often thrown at Mage Knight is it has too much luck to be a strategy game. So I think in order to address that, we need to actually think about what strategy is, and if it is even a strategy game in the first place.
So definitions of strategy then. I guess for me, strategy is just about the long-term planning that you undertake as a player in order to either solve a game as a solo player or defeat the game or defeat your opponent. It's all about your sort of schemes, your plans to achieve your ultimate objective, right? So when you play a game, you make moves, you make decisions on a turn, and you always have in your mind an ultimate objective and goal and plan you're working towards. Your plan might shift and change, your strategy might adapt and develop, and that's fine. But there can be a strategy in a game makes it a strategy game, I think.
I think for me, it is more specific than that. I think a lot of what you said there, it kind of applies to strategy, but a lot more of it applies to tactics, right? So the whether it's useful to have this kind of binary in place is something I know Kendall has really strong opinions on, which is one of the reasons we actually wanted them on the show in the first place. But there is a difference. And one thing you said there, Scruffy, is your strategy can change. And well, if your strategy is changing from turn to turn based on whether it's player uncertainty or whether it's, in case of Mage Knight, randomness, that demonstrates to me a much more tactical game, in that it's developing short-term plans to an overall objective. I do think there is a crossover. I think you can have an overall strategy to be strong enough to defeat the cities, but that's not a high-level strategy. And that's what I mean when I say Mage Knight isn't really it's not really a game with high strategy, because the way in which you get strong enough is by reacting constantly to the feedback the game's giving.
Yeah, I think you're right. That is a very much a semantic difference we've got there between tactics and strategy. I see something like a game of rock, paper, scissors, for example, even as having a strategy. You choose your weapon, your action, based on your strategy. I think they're going to pick rock, so I'm going to pick paper, right? That's a kind of strategy in my mind. And so that would be a fairly simple strategy. Can you give me an example of what would be a high-level strategy game, unlike Mage Knight then? Because I can't think of anything that's a high-level strategy game if Mage Knight isn't.
Sure. So again, I think the issue that people take with this is because I think, and as I mentioned earlier, we as a hobby attribute a lot of value to the word strategy. We think of it as strategy is you overcoming obstacles to carry out an overall plan. So all games with value should be a strategy game. We value the word so much that I think Paul Grogan, who designed the Krang expansion and the Shades of Tesla expansion for Mage Knight, well, co-designed those expansions, went ahead and on a recent podcast and said that when people used to ask what kind of games he plays, the first question is, what, like Monopoly? And I'm sure we've all had that reaction. And what you would normally say to that was, no, games with more strategy. I mean, that's how much value we attribute to this word. We almost define our whole hobby as we are strategists. But to answer your question, Scruffy, when I say high-level strategy, immediately I think because the amount of value we attribute to that word, you think this must be a really hard game. But I don't think that is the case. When I say high-level strategy, I mean a game where you can come in with a specific, not just end goal, but a strategy for how you're going to get there. That is my mind as a strategy. So, for example, Caverna. In Caverna, I can have a strategy of I will get my goal is to get the most points. And my strategy is I will get a stone engine, a wood engine, a food engine, my worker engine, and then my scoring engine. And by doing those 5 clear steps, and I can go in even more detail because I can tell you which rooms that I could take to do that. And in fact, if given enough time, I could probably map that out without playing the game, right? Mm-hmm. That's an example. If it was on a spectrum and strategy was on the right and tactical was on the left, I think Mage Knight wouldn't be way, way, way on the left, but it would be leftward tilting, and Caverna would be way on the right. Now, I think because we think of strategy as this very important thing, when I say Caverna is a high-level strategy game, I can probably tell listeners have got their backs up immediately, especially if they don't like Caverna. Like, Mage Knight is way better than Caverna. How can you not say it's a strategy game? But when I recently went back and watched some of your playthroughs on YouTube, Scruffy, I watched your Mage Knight playthrough, and I went back and watched your Feast for Odin playthrough. A Feast for Odin is another game where I would consider having a lot of strategy. And you can tell the difference in the language you're using in both playthroughs. When you played a Feast for Odin, you were saying things like, I don't want to do the animals. I did the animals last time. Meaning, I know I can go the whole game without taking animals. I can employ a high-level strategy where at the beginning of the game, I can tell you I'm never going to do that action. Whereas when you were playing Mage Knight, you were like, well, normally I would take this skill, but, given what's happened, I'm going to take this skill instead. Normally I would take this spell, but because I'm next to this Mage Tower, I'll take Mana Bolt, and that means that next turn I'll be able to do this. You didn't have long-term plans. You had 1 or 2 plans ahead. You had very tactical level way of thinking about it. I'm going to explore here. Oh, that's really hard. That means I need to go back and take on this ancient ruin because otherwise I'm not going to do anything this round. I mean, you can tell it's a tactical game because at the start of every round, you don't choose a strategy. You choose. I'm being silly there, but that's kind of what I mean. I don't know. Does anyone else want to jump in on this? What do you think?
Are you ready for my hot take?
Yes, please.
Sure. Just quickly, want to throw out before we get the mic drop from Kendall here. Just I don't know if I haven't rewatched my old YouTube video, but this latest one I did notice a lot more what you might call strategic decisions. Maybe it comes with experience from playing the game a bit more, but perhaps my latest video would put pay to some of that. Carry on, Kendall.
Are you ready for my hot take?
About as ready as I'll ever be.
Hell yeah.
I mean, I'm not going to blow your minds or anything, I think, but or destroy your arguments with facts and reason. I don't think that distinguishing between tactics and strategy in games is a particularly useful endeavor. I don't think it's a useful dichotomy to have. I think it's extremely rigid, and the way that it's treated as kind of almost mutually exclusive. I don't think that it's useful to categorize things as tactical versus strategic in gaming. So I can kind of understand it in something where there's multiple levels, such as in an actual war, where your strategy is kind of you're moving the abstract wooden blocks around the picture of the country, and the tactics are what your men are actually doing in battle. But in a game, I don't think there's ever really that huge amount of separation. And I think what gets labeled as tactical in Mage Knight is more of a kind of opportunistic style of strategy, an opportunistic style of decision making than it is a pre-planned style. And I think that is in part a reaction to the amount of random input that you get. You mentioned Caverna, obviously, Norm, as a more strategic game. That, when you play it solo, is a game with zero randomness. It is entirely deterministic. So it is almost a puzzle more than it is anything, and there's not much room for that opportunistic play. But the opportunistic nature, I think, is different from not having a long-term plan. You don't go in with a predefined idea of what to do. You go in with a vague kind of notions, and one forms over time. So I think a good example of some other similar games would be something like Slay the Spire, or even if you look at something like Rollway Station. I would consider those to be games with opportunistic play, where every time you're offered an option, you think, will this help me win the game? Right? That's ultimately what you're doing when you make a decision. You're saying, am I going to win the game because I do this? Will this increase or decrease the chances of me winning? And at the start of the game, those probabilities are going to be roughly 50-50, right? There's going to be a slant. So for a character like Norowas, making a decision that gives you more influence and lets you pick more units, he's already good with units and influence. So there's going to be some weight there. But roughly everything has an even chance of kind of helping you win the game. But as your deck grows and as your tableau grows, the first few decisions you make opportunistically guide you over time, because they change those percentage chances of will this help you win the game. because cards play off each other, units play off each other, skills will stack with each other. So I think you're right to say that early on, you don't really go in with a plan of, I'm going to go for all the keeps this game, because you might not know that there are going to even be any keeps. But you get to a point, and I think you start to see the point quite early in a game of Mage Knight, where you go, right, I've got the Savage Monks because they were cheap and available and I wanted a unit. I had the influence to get them at this point. However, what that now means is I have access to a fairly accessible siege attack. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be focusing on fortified sites. And I know you say, yes, you can't plan to take all the keeps and all of the mage towers and so on. But there are typically, in a game, you play with 7 of 14 countryside tiles, so half of the tiles. And of the tiles that have a keep or a mage tower, you're guaranteed almost to get 3 or 4. I haven't done the exact maths, but you'll get around 3 or 4, which can guide you. And a lot of places that have a keep will also have a monster den on them, for example. So you have the choice there of which to focus on. And that focus is going to be dictated by your kind of long-term organic strategy, I suppose, without wanting to use the word.
And I think that happens even not just throughout the whole game, but even to a lesser extent through the rounds on a micro level. Because you start with your deck of cards and gradually the randomness becomes more predictable. For example, your deck becomes smaller. You have a better idea of what's coming next, so you're able to plan more turns ahead. The mana becomes depleted the more you roll it, so your choices become less. You have a much clearer idea of what you're going to need to do on each turn. And do I think it's a useful distinction? It's a difficult one. I see your point, and I think it's a point really, really well made, Kendall. But I think that I do think it's a good distinction to have, because I think specifically with games like Mage Knight, where so many of your decisions are going to be reactionary, so many of your decisions are going to be opportunistic, as you described it, or tactical, as I put it. Calling Mage Knight a strategy game, the fact is, the distinction does exist and people do use it. And I've seen it. I've seen it in the wild. I've seen it on Facebook groups. People saying Mage Knight has too much luck to be considered a strategy game. And I think to myself, ain't nobody said it's a strategy game. You know?
I think that's entirely the heart of it. That it seems like for you, tactics and strategy are entirely intrinsically tied up with output and input randomness. The example you gave of Caverna is a game that has no randomness, and so obviously no output randomness. So I think all the moments of output randomness in Mage Knight are what force you to see it as a tactical game rather than a strategic game, because it's at those moments that you start forming a strategy or developing a new strategy. The fact that you can't see what tiles are coming up, what units are coming up, whatever, and that you have to react to the locations as they appear, the output randomness is what, in your mind, I suppose, makes it a tactical rather than strategic game. And that is entirely tied up in what the commenters you've seen are saying. It's too lucky to be a strategy game, right? So I guess the distinction there is an important one, because it's clearly on people's mind, and I think it is entirely linked to the discussion topic of this episode. Output randomness is inherently not strategic, seems to be the message a lot of people feel and think. I personally entirely don't agree with that, and I think that opportunistic or tactical, whatever word you want to use, opportunistically formed strategy is still strategy in a very, very similar vein to any other strategy. It's just more fluid, more developing, and I personally think it's a weird. I'm with you, Kendall. It's a weird thing to sort of say, well, that's not strategy. I think it's just another form of strategy, and it's very rare that you'll see games like Caverna that completely remove randomness as an element. And so in that case, it's very rare that you'll find a game that is a strategy game if you say that any form of output randomness or luck or whatever you want to call it disqualifies something from being a strategy game.
Well, a lot of your language there of you're disqualifying it from being a strategy game. I'm not.
Well, I mean, you've said Mage Knight is not a strategy game.
But you're making it sound like I'm demoting it by saying that.
No, not at all. But the words we use to describe a game are important, and it's exactly what other people are saying. I mean, they're saying it in a kind of negative way. Mage Knight isn't a strategy game. It's too lucky. It's a bad game. You're saying, sure, it's a game that's not a strategy game. I agree. I still think it's a great game. I don't think I'm talking in terms of value here. I am just talking in terms of what is being tested for the player and what is being asked of the player and the way the player is being invited to interact with the game. It is still a strategic game in that sense, even with the output randomness baked in.
Yeah, and interestingly, Scruffy, it's a lot of the input randomness that I think makes it reactionary and tactical. For example, if we start diving into some of the specific random events now, I was considering the setup. So if you have any experience with Mage Knight, you probably know that you shouldn't start planning your mode of attack or your mode of trying to win the game before you see the setup. Can we agree on that much at least?
No, I can't. With Wolfhawk, for example, I played with, again, it's open to change. But I start the game as Wolfhawk. I know she is good at ranged attack. So my strategy is going to be to try and develop a ranged attack deck, to try and develop ranged attack units. That's an example, but yeah, for sure. So that's something that happens. I guess you could say it's after setup, but you choose your Mage Knight sometimes. So
sure. Okay.
Neither randomness, right?
No problem, Scruffy. Let's run with that then. So then you choose your strategy, and now you're hit with 7 areas of randomness. The unit offer develops, the spell offer develops, the advanced action offer develops, your hand is then drawn, your exploration tiles are drawn, and your enemy tokens are drawn, and your mana pool is rolled.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not at all clear that, in fact, ranged attack would be something you couldn't even dream of developing with what you've seen.
Yep.
So yes, you can have a strategy going in, but my point is you've got Wolfhawk there and you're ready to go, and then Tovak kicks your door down, grabs your strategy by the lapels, throws out the window and goes, no, you need enemies with physical resistance because that's the unit offer. And you go, oh yeah, that would be better because if I take that unit with physical resistance, I can then go to that keep and they can take that hit and win, and then I get to draw an extra card. And
so maybe you adopt a new strategy.
Yeah, but that's exactly what I mean by it's not. There are strategies in, like I said in my point, it isn't a binary. If Mage Knight wouldn't be all the way to the left on the tactical and made up tactical and strategic spectrum, but it'd be leftward facing because yes, you can develop strategies, and like Kendall said, you can get an idea of. Yes, with the cards that I've pulled, I'm starting to develop a somewhat strategy, but that you have to often change and adapt it and tactically make reactionary decisions. And on top of that, the type of strategy that you guys are describing isn't particularly, like I said, isn't particularly not high level. That's the wrong term, but it's not very long term. You can't really go more than a few turns ahead, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So I'm not disagreeing. I'm not saying, I guess I was, in my clickbaity opinion at the start of the episode saying Mage Knight isn't a strategy game. That's obviously not true. You've both demonstrated there are elements of strategy, but I guess what I'm trying to say is the thing I love about Mage Knight is the challenge, it is the reactions, it is how the game, like I said, it grabs your strategy and it throws it out the window and goes, plan again, try again, idiot, keep going. I love that. For me, it's what makes the game great.
Yeah, I think you're right to make the distinction that not being a strategy game, as you called it, or maybe being a game with some random elements, however we want to define it, doesn't make something not a good game.
Yeah.
And ultimately, with all of the kind of disagreement over the terminology, It's why I just go, hey, let's just use the word strategy and tactics interchangeably, like 90% of the non-gamer population does, and use a more precise, specialized term. You know what I mean by opportunistic, and I've described what it means. Neither of you are quibbling over the fact that I chose to use the word opportunistic and called it, an opportunistic decision game. When, okay, maybe people aren't going to use that naturally. They're going to say, oh, it's quite tactical or whatever, or there's short-term decisions or something. But I feel like using more precise language, the two words themselves have become so muddied, and there's such a varied path to get into games. And I genuinely do find that it is mostly gamers who think that there's a distinction between strategy and tactics. Like, I feel confident in saying, if you ask a random person off the street what the difference between strategy and tactics is, if they're not into military history or games, they'll probably say they're the same thing.
Yeah.
And the thing is, people aren't born gamers. People come and become gamers from different areas. So some people come from the very rigid, no, these are two extremely different things. And some people come from the, they're just the same thing, innit? Kind of school of thought. And I think ultimately, by having the discussions and the disagreements over the terminology, we're almost depriving ourselves of more interesting analysis by moving past it and saying, okay, it's not a strategic game, it's not a tactical game, it's an opportunistic decision-making game. And then talking about what that means and how it makes the player feel, and why is it a good game because of that, and how could it do that better. And I think there's so much more interesting stuff to do if we discard the term strategy and tactics and discard the disagreements that come with them and start fresh.
Absolutely.
And I suppose this is my call to action now. I've become a content creator. This is my call to action. You slam that like button. You sign my online petition to ban tactics and strategy from game discussion.
Yeah, we've discussed it here. We've laid it all out. That's it. The end of discussion, guys. It's done.
That's it. No one needs to talk about this anymore.
Although I was the one pushing the hardest for this chat, I wholeheartedly agree. Agree.
Yes. Me too. I think you're absolutely right, Kendall. I think use whatever word feels right for you and whatever. But I think it's a really important point to bring up, and I'm really glad you did, Norm, because a lot of the discourse around games does end up going towards it's not a strategy game because X, therefore it's a rubbish game.
There's such a value judgment tied up in it.
Yes.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, Norm, to kind of debunk that and dismantle it completely and say, well, you could argue any game's not a strategy game if you wanted, and it's
yeah,
exactly. I was also hoping we could have a look again a bit more at the input randomness. We've spoken a lot about output randomness this episode. I'd love to talk a bit more about Mage Knight's input randomness as well.
I mean, Mage Knight is full of input randomness. I mean, the 7 areas of randomness I highlighted in the setup, all of which is input, and you see all of these areas before making the decision. I think that's one of the things that makes the game as hard as what it is, because you have to constantly replan based on what those 7 areas are. Not just people say, "Oh, it's your hand of cards," but it's not just that, is it? It's the whole thing. You do have to know what's in the unit offer. You do have to know what exploration tiles you have and what enemies you've drawn and what mana you've rolled, and all of these things you have to bear in mind. And I think it's the input randomness that really lights this game up in incredible ways. Kendall, where do you want to start with this?
Well, I was most interested, honestly, with the tiles. That's where I kind of thought the randomness was the most interesting, especially because you kind of pitched this episode as the discussion about when people say Mage Knight is too lucky or there's too much random stuff going on in Mage Knight. I often really feel like the main complaint seems to be the tiles, rather than other things. And I was kind of interested in investigating that. So I actually spent several hours putting a spreadsheet together with all of the tile data from the game. Now, I don't own Shades of Tesla, but the other two...
That's okay. Shades of Tesla doesn't add any new exploration tiles, I don't think.
Excellent. So I input onto a spreadsheet the contents of every single one of the tiles. There's not actually that many tiles in the game. There's 26 tiles if you include the starting tile. And I put in every feature, so monasteries, villages, monster dens, and so on, and also the composition of the movement costs of the tiles. And I ran some averages, and it was quite interesting actually. There is quite a big fluctuation, in particular in the one area that I perceive to have the most complaints about, which is move cost and getting screwed by movement costs in tiles on the tiles. And Scruffy, you even mentioned earlier that you had a story about flipping a tile and you were screwed because there was impassable terrain in front of you, or people go, oh, there's a swamp in front of me, I can't move. And I was really interested to see that actually several of the tiles don't have much to offer, despite the fact they cost a lot of movement points to get past.
Really? So they're just worse tiles.
So it's not, I don't think it's it's not a holistic analysis at all. It doesn't take everything into account, of course, because obviously the best tile for you is whatever you need in that specific moment. If you have a handful of wounds and one big move card to be able to get to a magical glade or whatever, then the tile that is like 5 magical glades or whatever, if there was one, would be the best tile because you need to get rid of those wounds. Whereas obviously this is a more generic thing. But what I did is I took the average move cost of terrain of the terrain in each tile, and then I calculated what I call the deck value add per move point. And the deck value add is any location that allows you to recruit units, to fight monsters or otherwise gain fame, or to add cards to your deck. So anything that's going to basically make you better at going back to Tovak's 3 pockets, anything that's going to put stuff into those 3 pockets, I considered a deck value add. And if it was a keep, say, where you fight a monster to get fame, and a spell tower, mage tower, where you fight a monster to get fame and then a card added into your deck, that counts twice. And the fluctuation in some of these tiles was massive. It was huge. Some of them are half a point. I mean, the raw number doesn't really mean much, but the range ranges from tiles with less than 1 up to tiles with over 2, which is essentially every movement point that you have on the tiles with 2, you're able to reach 2 opportunities to improve your deck. Whereas the one that's a 0.5 is you need 2 movement points to reach even 1 opportunity to improve your deck on that tile, which I found really, really interesting.
That is really interesting. And one of the things I find interesting about exploration is the kind of choice that goes into where you explore. I think oftentimes where the complaint comes in is that you've been screwed by pure chance and you had no choice about it. But the truth is, you have a lot of decisions about where you explore. And, like, for example, if you're somewhat experienced and you're on a tile with 2 lakes, you wouldn't explore next to those 2 lakes if the next tile is a core tile, because there's a pretty good chance that it could be the Blue City. And I've seen people post all the time going, look at this, I've got a wall of lakes. How did that happen? Well, you explored next to 2 lakes. Like, there was a very real chance that would happen. You're almost inviting danger upon yourself.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because at some point then the core tiles specifically, especially, and maybe even with experience, all of the countryside tiles kind of get logged in your data banks and become more and more predictable as you play, and you kind of know what to anticipate and expect. It kind of mitigates some of that randomness there, doesn't it?
And I think it goes back to what I was saying right at the beginning of the episode. Mage Knight has a huge skill ceiling, and a big part of that is understanding where the game can mess you up. Like, I don't think that has happened to me for the last maybe 20 plays. And it's not because I've been lucky. It's because I won't explore next to 2 lakes when the next tile is a core tile, because I understand that there's a pretty decent chance. There's only 4 core tiles in the box, and 2 of them have to be a city. There's only 4 cities. It's pretty likely that it could well be the blue city. And if I do that, I'm taking that output randomness into my own hands, and I'm kind of throwing myself over to the gods of chaos. And that's fine if you want to do that, but you have to accept that that was your decision. It wasn't luck, if that makes sense. And
But I mean, to some extent, it was still luck, though, wasn't it? Because yeah, you could still account for that and be like, well, it might be the blue city, but I'm going to roll those dice. And then it is still rolling those dice, is still output randomness, and it is still luck. On another day, you might get away with it.
I think that's one of my favorite things about the game, though, is that it has those output randomness events, but the game lets you choose when to have it. It reminds me of Scythe, where in Scythe, there is no output randomness, but there is some level of player uncertainty when you battle. So when you battle, there is player uncertainty. You don't know how much power and what attack card your opponent is going to play. But you, on your turn, choose whether you want to battle or not. So you wouldn't ever battle at a time where you knew you couldn't guarantee victory. And it's the same with Mage Knight. Mage Knight does have output randomness, but if you choose to interact with it in a risky way, then you are doing so. And you better be doing so because you find that risk fun, because if you're not going to have a nice time. But the interesting thing is the game allows you to make those decisions. It allows you to roll a dice or not, or just leave the dice on the table. Don't roll the dice at all, And I think that's lovely.
Yeah, I can see how it'd be frustrating for someone who hasn't played as much as us, though, and doesn't know to anticipate the blue tile.
I think Mage Knight's actually really good at not pandering to, but easing in newer players. I think it has a really, really lovely mix of being accessible while having the knowledge really, really pay off. Because Norm said he's used his knowledge of the core tiles and so on to avoid being trapped. But at the same time, a lot of what Mage Knight does is it limits your options in a way so that you can care about what might come next. But if you don't know what's going to come next because you don't have that level of knowledge yet, you still aren't overwhelmed by the amount of decisions that you have to make. To give a more concrete example, you might be very deliberately controlling the flow of the advanced actions to manipulate what's in the dummy player's deck. And you might be going, I'm going to try and cycle through them slightly faster than normal because there's an advanced action I really want and I hope it comes up. And that's kind of the high knowledge level. And then the low knowledge level is simply, I don't know what any of the advanced actions do, but there's only 3 in front of me. So when I have to make that decision, it's a very accessible and easy decision. And I think that's a really, really beautiful little balance that Mage Knight strikes really well in so many ways.
I agree.
Yeah. And just returning to input randomness for a second, I'm glad you mentioned the dummy player because I really wanted to talk about that it is my favorite moment of input randomness, I think, in the whole game. And I love it. I love it in solo play. That at the start of your turn, or just before your turn, or just after, however you want to look at it, the on-beat and off-beat. So during the on-beat and off-beat of your turn, you have the dummy player make a move. And that move is to flip over 3 cards and then maybe some more cards and set the pace and the tone for your turn. That input randomness that goes right before you act and tells you, okay, here's how fast you need to be thinking about going now. It's just wonderful for me. Like the whole start of my playthrough, I was playing with, I said I was playing with Wolfhawk, didn't I? Wolfhawk was a dummy player in my playthrough. I did an analog play after. So in my game, I was playing with Arathea. Wolfhawk was the dummy player. Wolfhawk was playing so gently throughout the whole start of the game. And then she just suddenly started speeding up. So after the first round, she started speeding up through her deck. And that made me have to start rushing my turns in response to that input randomness at the offbeats of my turns. I love that in Mage Knight.
And I think that goes again to the heart of where the opportunities are to increase your skill with the game, because as Kendall mentioned, limiting what is available to the dummy player helps control that level of input randomness as well. And I think it hits to the heart of the kind of point I was trying to make this episode, which is it is actually manipulating the randomness, which is the areas which you can improve in your play style.
Yeah.
And when I first started playing, I didn't pay any attention to what went into the dummy players, but now obviously it's a very important part of what I choose from the advanced action and the spell offer as well. And yeah, it's just another wonderful example of, yes, and there is that area of randomness and it does affect you. The game gives you a delicious little bit of agency. Every time there is a random event, there is also, if you not too far, you don't have to look too far to also find the agency.
Yes, 100% agree. You flip the tile over even, and you get a wall of lakes. That might cut off one path to you, but then you don't have only one path open to you. You have multiple paths open to how you're going to react.
Yeah, absolutely. And even what I was saying about where you explore in the first place. So there's where you explore, then what you've got, and then what you do with that decision afterwards. You don't have to look very far to find the agency. It's great.
And the agency and the multiple paths kind of brings on to actually the very, very first thing I wrote down in my notes for this episode. But I think one thing that is important to remember with Mage Knight and playing it as a solo game is it is a multiplayer game with a solo variant. Like, it's designed as a multiplayer game. I don't know that when Vlada was putting the game together that he really knew that it was going to be such a big solo game. And when you look at the scenario list, the solo, it's well supported, right? A lot of the scenarios have a win condition, so you can straight up play them solo, and it does kind of hint at that in the scenario book. But a fair majority of them are multiplayer exclusive. And it is it's not. I'm not saying it's supposed to be a multiplayer game, but it's designed as a multiplayer game with a solo mode. And I think sometimes when people go, "Oh, I've got really unlucky. It's not, the game's not being fair," is in solo you're not working with the same tools as anyone else. You don't have someone else to share in that misfortune. Whereas in a multiplayer game, which is kind of, I think, where a lot of the mechanics were focused on, everyone's working with mostly the same tools, right? You have a slightly different character, but if you have a hard game, if you have a tricky map, or if you have some really unsynergistic rubbish in the advanced action offer or whatever, everyone has to deal with that. And there are tools for getting around it and making sure other people have to deal with it more. Whereas in a solo play, you don't get that. And I think that's when some of the luck can start to feel a bit more unfair. And I was wondering if there's a way to develop some sort of dynamic difficulty scaling module almost for people who prefer to have the more sort of fair thing, like, let's run the stats, this tile is worse for playthroughs. Statistically, people only win 40% of the games where this tile comes out as opposed to 50 with other tiles, let's say. So what it does is it reduces the level of the final city by 1 if it comes out. Something like that.
Have the hard tiles, you only shuffle one hard
tile in. I don't know. I don't really want to develop that myself because I don't think that's going to be that interesting. But I wonder if there's a way to do it. I think because that would help mitigate, I think, some of the luck in a solo play.
So just off the back of that, I love what you're saying there, but I absolutely take it the other way. I personally find that the luck is less affecting in a solo game than in a competitive multiplayer game. Because in a competitive multiplayer game, you're often going down two completely opposing sides of the map almost. So if one of you has a bad game, you already said, you're pulling up all the bad tiles and the other person's getting all the lovely tiles. That's how I've often experienced a competitive game of Mage Knight Go. Whereas in the solo game, it is only you. And you're actually selling me on the idea of maybe a cooperative game of Mage Knight, where I've only played that once before and actually had quite a lot of fun with it.
Yeah, and I would have to agree with you there, Scruffy. We've played a number of multiplayer, two-player games. And I would consider, in a lot of games, I would say you are a more skilled player than I am. But in Mage Knight, I do think we have quite a similar footing. And you can disagree with that if you like, but I think we're quite similarly skilled when it comes to Mage Knight.
Totally agree.
The thing is, when we've played it, I've had games where you've trounced me, and I've had games where I've trounced you. And I can always narrow it back to a point where something bad happened on your tile, and at the same time that I've managed to speed ahead. Or I've developed my character earlier than you have, and it's created a snowball effect. And I don't think that is inherently to do with the randomness, but it's more so how your character is built. Your character in Mage Knight, one level up makes a huge difference. Whoever gets the helping hand first is, if you're an experienced player and the tiles flip your way, you're just going to run away. And I think that's one of the reasons why I personally prefer it as a solo game or a cooperative game.
Yeah, and I think that does come from a lot of the times that you say helping hand, that initial burst of speed, momentum for your Mage Knight will often come from a fortuitous tile turn or a fortuitous keep or enemy or whatever coming up that comes for you and doesn't come for your other player, or just it being a slight edge over your other player. It's very rare that you both start on the same footing and continue on the same footing throughout the whole game and come to the end, having had a similar level of fortune and momentum going in. That's something that you're right on. It snowballs.
My response to that is simply, well, you're not doing a good enough job of blocking your opponent from good spots then. But I feel like I'm not going to convince you of that.
I mean, I played a game, a blitz scenario with a person who shall not be named, and I tried to trace it back to when I started pulling away, and I realized it was when I went first and I got to a village before them, and there was nothing else. There was nothing they were powerful enough to kill, so I had to go exploring, whereas I was able to plunder the village and get a mage tower, level up, and get a spell. So I was able to do that in 2 turns, where they spent the first 2 turns exploring. But then something more wonderful happened. Everything they left behind when they explored that they were still too weak to do, I had to spend less movement points to get there. And I had a more powerful deck because I just leveled up and got a spell to then take on the things that they left. So I had an even easier game, and it came down to they picked the wrong tactic on the first turn.
Well, yeah, that and the hand they drew wasn't enough to take out that first enemy for them. That's luck, right? They drew an unfortunate hand.
Well, it wasn't strong. It wasn't good enough for me either, which is why I had to stop at the village. Had they gone first, they would have done the same thing, and the roles would have been reversed. And I think that all came down to the input randomness of both the hands we drew and the exploration tiles. The mistake they made was they let me go first, and they paid for it for the rest of the game.
But I mean, during the setup, that might not have been a choice for them, or for you. If they had taken the number 1 day card, they'd have gone first. No choice for you there, then, is there?
Yeah, I was lucky. They did pick first, and I think they went for planning. So I took Mana Steel and went on my merry way and trounced them, if I'm honest. And I've had it happen. I'm not boasting there. It's happened to me a bunch of times for Mage Knight, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's an excellent solo game, because when you get those moments of this particular setup is really tricky, it's just a puzzle for me to overcome, and no one else is profiteering off of the back of it.
Yes, couldn't agree more.
I will. No, it's okay. I will accept that this is a solo gaming podcast. I understand that I am in the minority with believing that Mage Knight is better as a multiplayer game, but you do you. I don't think I'm going to convince you like I did on the on the efficacy of ditching strategy and tactics as terms. I think that's the convincing I've done today.
You've used all your convincing points.
I have. I need to rest for 8 hours.
And I've been talked around as well this episode from where I started. I mean, I still think that in multiplayer games, specifically for Mage Knight, the output randomness is irksome, and I think it's a problem in a lot of multiplayer games. But in solo player games, that output randomness isn't a problem in Mage Knight at all for me. And I do think that I'm perhaps a little bit too quick to say all output randomness in multiplayer games is bad, but we've already talked about it here today about the certainty of binaries and stuff being kind of flawed. And I think that there is a place for it, even in multiplayer games, and that it is more nuanced and subtle than just input good, output bad all the time. You know, it's baked into so many different systems in games, and you don't even notice it sometimes that it's there, and it can it just lead to the most dramatic and wonderful moments in games, even multiplayer games.
Well said.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think Kendall made the really good point about the artifacts. You know, I hadn't even really noticed that it was. I mean, obviously, it's a random event that happens in the game. You know, you draw 2. That's random. But because of the way it's executed, and I think Scruffy, you nailed this, because all artifacts are good artifacts, I've never even once thought about it. But yeah, it is essentially output randomness to an extent. You know, you make a decision to get an artifact or to try to win an artifact, and you get a random one. And it's all to do with the execution, I think. And this is why I think Mage Knight gets away with it in the way that, yes, you know, it has a reputation for being a thinky game, a planny game, whether you want to call that strategy or tactics or reactionary or whatever. It doesn't really matter, to be honest. Sorry, you had to listen to us talk about it for me to conclude it doesn't matter. But whatever you want to call it, the interesting thing is the way randomness is used in Mage Knight is it's coupled every time with agency. And because it's coupled every time with agency, the more you play, the better you get at anticipating, the more your skill will increase. And it's one of the reasons why, yes, you can have a game full of randomness, but also it has, like I keep saying, a high skill ceiling. You are able to improve at this game. It's not rejecting the randomness, it's embracing it, getting better at it, understanding where your decisions are. You know, often I see people say, I've seen it suggested on the Discord, I can't remember who said it, and forgive me because I can't remember exactly who said it, but I think they said if I could make one house rule for Mage Knight, it would be I would get to mulligan if I draw no movement. And I think you make your decision after you draw your cards. You know, that's the point of the game that people need to improve on. I still need to improve on, having played it all these times. You need to understand that you're not supposed to be making your decisions about your next turn to a complete extent. You're not supposed to have one thing in mind that you can be screwed over. You're supposed to have multiple contingency plans, as Kendall described it. And I think that's, the randomness adds to that level of planning, that level of contingency making, and that's why it's a challenging game and a difficult game. And again, I want to keep playing over and over and over.
Yeah, and like you say, it leads to that agency. I think if I would sum it up in a nutshell, I think it gets away with the randomness because it gives you agency, like you say, and it gives you a reward. It gives you an incentive or a reward. When you draw your hand and there's new movement cards, it feels kind of bad sometimes, but other times it can be like exciting having all those attack cards. When you draw an artifact and you don't know what you're going to get, you do get a choice of something good coming into your deck. You know, whatever it is, whatever the randomness. When the tiles, back to your favorite thing there, Kendall, for randomness, when you flip over that tile, you are presented with the reward of options and agency. It's that in a nutshell, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's both right there. You flip it over, there's all those lovely, exciting things to go and look at and do, and you are allowed to choose whether to do them or whether to just explore another tile.
Absolutely.
Is there any other areas of randomness in the game? I feel like there are lots of other areas of randomness,
Yes,
but I feel like I've kind of made my point. My point is that the randomness it doesn't just get away with it. It is the best part. It's the best part of the game, you know? It's what makes it interesting. It's what gives it life and soul. And I just want to kiss it in the face.
It's those rough edges that it needs to be fun.
Okay, so I think that's pretty much all I want to say on the randomness. I think in summary, it doesn't just get away with it. The game is the randomness. It is the life and soul of the game, and it's understanding the randomness that will help you get better at the game as well. So I think that's pretty much all I want to say in regards to it. Is there anything else you want?
Yeah, I just want to add, and I want to kiss it on the face.
I would also like to kiss Mage Knight.
Is there anything else you guys want to bring up on the randomness before we go ahead and look at the responses we got from last episode?
No, I'm good to move on. It's been a long episode, guys. I hope you've enjoyed this massive meandering debate. Sorry, Kendall, if you have something.
No, I was going to say I feel like if I bring anything more up, it'll add another hour to the runtime. So I thankfully don't have any more points to make. I feel like we've covered everything and more.
Yeah, I think we'll go away from this though and be like, I wish we'd brought X, Y, and Z up. We'll do another Mage Knight Revisited episode in a year's time.
Well, I mean, in terms of randomness, something for the future. This is where you end your scholarly article, right? We've done this is the end of the paper, right? What you end with in your conclusion is where you're going to take your research next. And I think something that I'd like to do in the future, and I don't know whether that would be on this podcast with you guys or what, but is a bit of a sort of an analysis on deck building games in general and how cycles and the way you draw your cards, but you cycle through all your cards would be, it'd be really interesting just to investigate that.
Yes.
We haven't really done a big deep dive into deck building games for sure. Let's move on to the questions, though, shall we? From last episode. Before we do that, what is the question for this episode, Norm?
Okay, so the question for this episode is: what is an example of a time you've encountered randomness in a game and it hasn't sat well with you at all? It's spoiled the game, or maybe spoiled your turn, or just left you with a sour taste in your mouth. And on the other side of that coin, what's an example of randomness or random mechanic in a game that you thought was really interesting or innovative, or just something that brought a lot of joy to the experience, enhanced the story, or gave you a lovely crunchy decision to make, or whatever it might be? Why do you think one sat well with you and the other didn't? How were they executed? We'd love to know.
Yeah, that's great. So we'll move on to the responses we had from last episode now. Last episode we asked, what is your favourite board game adaptation of a video game? And we got quite a lot of responses. So the first response here was from Comrade Boris, who says, not necessarily a licensed example, but through the ages, this is Civilization, the board game, through and through. I have high hopes for Europa Universals, but that has yet to be delivered. An interesting one there, because Civilization has a board game adaptation as well, doesn't it? But yeah, I'm a big fan of Through the Ages, and I know you two have played it too.
Yes, love Through the Ages. It does capture the 4X style kind of grand strategy. I've never actually played Civilization though. So.
Well, I think it's a really interesting example because obviously Civilization was a board game first, and the Sid Meier's Civilization was inspired by the Francis Tresham, 1970s, was it, or early 80s board game Civilization.
I didn't know that.
So yeah, it's a very interesting one because it's like For the Ages is like a board game inspired by a video game inspired by a board game. It's Civilization Inception.
That's so true. And the digital version, I have played it Through the Ages, so I haven't played the physical version solo. I don't know if it is soloable, but the digital version is absolutely brutal if you play against the hard AI. That is my experience of that. So if you can trounce that AI, then you're doing something right.
Excellent. Now, we also had a response in from Stop Somewhere Eric, who said, the Stardew Valley game might be, if I could get my hands on it. I love the resource management feel, and the art style was top-notch from the look of everything. Top ones I've had the chance to isn't a solo game, but I love the two-player BioShock Infinite Stage of Columbia board game as a strategy game that feels like chess with a lot more to it and a push and pull feel to the mechanics that I love. There's a lot to unpack there. Have any of you guys played any of those at all?
Well, nobody can get hold of Stardew Valley at the moment. That's only kind of been released in America, and it's very hard to get hold of in the UK. It's a game I've got my heart set on finding because I've seen some playthroughs and it looks amazing. I don't know anything about the BioShock game.
No, I wasn't even aware there was a BioShock game.
So some things to add to the list there. Huh?
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm gonna have a pretty difficult time with this, I think, because to be even more antagonistic, I don't play video games, so so I'm like, oh, okay, what's that? I don't know. BioShock's the underwater one, right?
That's right.
Not BioShock Infinite though,
Excellent.
which is what that's a sequel to.
Oh, okay.
But, yeah.
See, caught
I
my
haven't
trousers
played that.
down already. I have no idea what that is.
Well, Stardew Valley looks amazing. It's a game where you kind of raise your little farm and go do mining and stuff and make friends with all the locals. It's a very chill game, very fun, very relaxing. And like I said, the board game adaptation does look really good. And it looks like the solo mode for it would be really good as well. Because, the video game's a pretty solo experience despite all their multiplayer things. I've never played it multiplayer, I only play it by myself. So...
Kendall, do you want to take the next one?
Next one is from Courrier. I assume it's French. Sorry if it's not. From what I played on TTS, I love the way Bullet Heart captured the feeling of a shoot 'em up, while being a fun puzzle. That's actually a really good point. I had never really considered a bullet hell kind of shoot 'em up board game. I really like Enter the Gungeon. That's a really fun video game. So if it captures that sort of feel, I'm all for it.
Yeah, that sounds really cool.
I think a lot of those kind of shoot 'em up style board games would fit in well with the episode, with the topic we just spoken about, because a lot of them have a whole chunk of output randomness. And this is something we haven't unpacked in the episode yet, but I think worth saying is sometimes the more output randomness you put in, the less lucky it feels, right? Because, statistically, the more you roll dice, the less it becomes luck and the more it becomes statistic, a matter of chance.
Yeah.
Right? So it's kind of interesting that the way those kind of shoot 'em up games handle output randomness is, well, let's just keep adding more and eventually it'll balance itself out. And true enough, it does, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, I'm looking at the game now. I've got no information about it other than what it looks like visually. The sort of player mats there kind of puts me in mind of Under the Falling Skies. So maybe maybe you've got a similar sort of thing there where you're trying to dodge the incoming waves of bullets. That would be really fun to try out. The next response we have is from Tigmic, who says, "This War of Mine is my choice. It's pretty faithful to the theme, story, and even mechanics of the video game." And we covered This War of Mine in episode
4.
Thank you, Norm. Episode 4 of the podcast, really early on, actually. That surprised me. I thought we did it a bit later than that. But it's, it was a really interesting game for us to play. If you want to find out more about that, check out our episode 4.
Yeah, This War of Mine is an extremely interesting board game. I've not played the video game, but if it captures that same feel, then I think that's the most important thing about This War of Mine, how it makes you feel. So Tigmic says that it captures even the mechanics of the video game, but to me that's almost secondary as long as it delivers on that same feeling, because I feel like This War of Mine is all a game about impact, the impact it has on you. I don't know what you guys think of that.
Can confirm it is miserable.
Oh, I still haven't played it, but from what I can tell, it's almost exactly the same.
Yeah.
Excellent. We also had a response from Peter Lovelace, who says, Cantaloupe is the perfect adaptation of a point-and-click adventure. So you're going to have to educate me, video game experts. What is a point-and-click adventure?
Okay, so a point-and-click adventure is, they're kind of usually quite retro in that they really had a heyday, sort of, I want to say in the 90s. Is that fair, Kendall, would you say?
Yeah,
Point and clicks?
80s, 90s.
Yeah.
Well, 80s was more text adventure.
Yeah, with things like Myst and things that were kind of pioneers for the sort of a graphical, like you got this beautiful still image world of, and what you do is you go around collecting items and trying to use those items to interact with the environment. You try and use the bamboo stick to make the panda move so that you can go through the door and progress in the game. And you're just trying to complete the game basically by solving puzzles.
They're very much typically puzzle games where you go and you speak to John the cleaner, and you get his broken broomstick, and then you use the broken broomstick to prop open the mouth of a hippo, so you can grab a diamond ring from inside its mouth, and then you use the diamond ring to propose to someone. And they often have quite a silly sort of moon logic chain of events going in them, but they're quite fun. They're quite interesting.
Yeah, I can't imagine how that would translate to a board game.
No, well, you say that, but Cooper backs up Peter here and says, seconded, Cantaloupe perfectly replicates the mechanisms of a point-and-click adventure in the vein of the classic LucasArts adventures, like Day of the Tentacle. Plus, it has funny dialogues and a great sense of humour. It's pretty hard to pull off being funny in a board game, but Cantaloupe pulls it off. It's a great game.
Yeah, the art style looks on point. I'm looking at some images now, but it also looks like a bit of a cryptic puzzle thing going on with just reams of code. It looks like a fun little experience to explore.
I'm interested to hear if it's kind of repeatable or if it's a one and done kind of thing like the Exit games. Can you replay it? And the last one we've got time for today is from Anway, who says, best video game adaptation? Of course, it's Guards of Atlantis 2. Tabletop MOBA, the best board game of all time. I love MOBAs.
Wow.
I have thousands of hours spread across League of Legends, Dota 2, Dawngate. I've tried loads of MOBAs. And I'm yet to see a tabletop game emulate them in a way that I like. So I'm going to have to check Guards of Atlantis 2 out.
And of course, MOBA, for those who don't play video games, it stands for more oranges before apples.
Absolutely, correct. 100%.
Game about fruit.
It's mangoes, oranges, bananas, apples.
Oh, sorry. You can tell I'm a video game novice.
Yeah, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, I play as well. I'm a big fan of MOBAs. I play Smite myself, and I've started getting into Heroes of the Storm a little bit recently. But the closest I've come board game wise was Cloudspire, which you played as well, Norm. Has kind of a MOBA-esque feel to it, I would say. You send your units to the opposing tower. I don't know. It feels quite MOBA-y to me anyway.
I think I'm getting what it feels like when people tune in to hear us talk about solo games and I somehow manage to talk about 18xx instead. I'm now getting how they feel, right, with this video game conversation.
But yeah, that definitely is one we'll have to try out if it's got a solo mode, because like Kendall says, there aren't that many MOBA board games that I know.
Scruffy, do you want to do a video game spin-off show?
That would be fun for me. I'd love to just sit and chat about video games. I'm equally as passionate about video games as I am about board games. So this has been a really fun question time for me.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. I'm learning as well. It's good. It's like, teach the idiot.
Yeah, well, I think that's all we've got time for today with such a long episode. If you've bared with us this long, very, very impressed with your fortitude, guys, and thanks for sticking with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. If we could just get that question again, Nom?
Yeah, the question is, can you name an example of a random event or random mechanic in a game that you disliked, and a random mechanic or random event in a game that you did like, and what was the reason for both? If you can only think of one on one side of the coin, feel free to write in anyway. And we haven't really said this before, but if you're listening to this after the fact, and in fact, even if you listen to this and it's the year 2025, and this is the first time you've heard this question, you've got a great answer for it, we still want to hear your answer. This isn't a trapped moment in time where you've missed your opportunity. Just jump on the Discord; it will still be there. Just jump on the Discord and give us your response on the listener questions. The links to that are, of course, in the description. We still want to know what you have to say.
So yeah, all that's left is to say a massive thank you then to Kendall for joining us today. Thank you so much, Kendall. You did not disappoint. As always, you've been an absolute delight to talk to.
Well, thank you for having me. I like coming on this show because you're nice to me at the end. It's like it was pleasant talking to you, and I'm thinking, well, was it? Oh, I must be doing something right.
It was fantastic, Kendall, as always. Before you go though, if you're thinking, okay, I've got some answers, I wanna give those answers, I wanna reach out to Always Player One. How can you do that? Well, you can reach out on the Discord, as I've already said. The links are in the description. You can also reach out on Facebook. Again, links are in the description. We're on Instagram as at alwaysplayer1podcast. We're on Reddit as always_player_1. And if you'd like to support the show, you can also check us out on Patreon. It's patreon.com/alwaysplayer1podcast. Any pledge amount you give us will give you access to our behind the scenes show, the planning phase. And by the way, we've got some big things coming up. The planning phase is where we talk about what's coming up on the show and sort of decide on air what we're going to be doing. And if you're not on the planning phase yet, you are missing out now, because we've got a lot in the pipeline and it's really exciting. But if you can't support us on Patreon, we do have some other stuff coming up, right, Scruffy? We should probably talk about that here. I know it's been a long episode, but this is pretty important, isn't it? It's big news.
Yeah, so this is up now, and we'll put links up on the Discord when we drop this episode. That is, we have a new method to support us now, as well as the Patreon, or instead of the Patreon, if you prefer. And that is, you can buy us a coffee at ko-fi.com. That's ko-fi.com/alwaysplayer1. And you just, if you've never interacted with coffee before, you do is choose how many coffees to buy me and Norm, and all the money goes directly to us with no fees being taken by the platform, which is good. And we intend to set some goals on there for when we've raised certain amounts. And we also that will be the space to watch for a potential merch store in the future when we finally get round to sourcing our merch. That will be where we host it.
Yeah, we've had a lot of people reaching out and saying, I'd love to support the show financially, but I don't like the monthly, agreement I have to enter with Patreon. Is there anything else I can do to support you? Can we buy you games? Can we contribute towards the cost of the upkeep in any kind of one-off manner? And this is a good compromise, we think, to get this coffee page set up. So the links to that are in the description if you didn't catch the address. But yeah, this is another way you can support the show is you can tell someone about us. When you guys talk about us online, or even just by word of mouth, it helps the show an unbelievable amount. One person talking about us online is way more effective than any kind of promotional post either of us could do. So yeah, if you don't want to support us on Ko-fi, can't support us on Patreon, just tell someone to check us out, because it goes a long way.
Yes.
I think that's all we've got time for. Thank you so much for joining us again, Kendall. Thank you so much for listening. And if you're not catching us on the planning phase, then we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Yes, thank you. And thank you again for joining us, Kendall.
Thanks so much for listening to Always Player One.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to support the show, don't forget to check out our Patreon page. The links to that are in the description. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of Always Player One. Until then, reach out on Facebook, Instagram, or by email to keep the conversation going.